There is a scene you know but have never named. Someone asks you how you're doing. You answer. The response comes out automatic, calibrated without hesitation. You did not even need to think. The system already knew what to say, and the question was asked with the exact expectation of receiving that answer, because the alternative would be uncomfortable for both of you. This is not politeness. It is a protocol, and you learned this protocol so early, so completely, that you can no longer distinguish when you are following the rule and when you are being honest, because being honest would cost something, and answering within the protocol costs nothing. This is the video about the cost of that, not for you individually, for everyone at the same time. You are not alone in this sensation, but no one told you that directly, and the absence of that information did quiet damage. There is something that most people carry and do not name: the perception that things are not as good as they seem, accompanied by the conclusion that this is a personal problem, a failure of adaptation, a fragility specific to you, in a world that apparently is working very well for everyone else. You observe your surroundings, people functioning, answering messages, showing up, completing tasks, displaying a stability that you feel you lack. And the brain does what it always does. It reads the available environment and constructs a hypothesis. The hypothesis is this: if everyone seems to be doing fine and I am not, then the problem is in me. That conclusion is not wrong because it is pessimistic. It is wrong because it is based on false data. The environment you are reading is not reality. It is performance, and performance was never reliable data. Think about what happens during a typical week. You go through situations that weigh on you, meetings that drain you, conversations that end badly, decisions that go unanswered, a fatigue that is not muscular. It is of another nature, more diffuse, less locatable. You try to name what you feel, and the language slips away. It is not sadness exactly. It is not anxiety in the clinical sense. It is something more like the weight of continuing to operate at a pace you did not consciously choose, toward goals whose urgency you question internally but not out loud. And then you come into contact with other people, colleagues, friends, family, acquaintances, and no one says anything. No one mentions the fatigue. No one names the weight. The conversations happen in the permitted registers. What is happening at work? Plans for the weekend? A mild complaint about something external? The real suffering and what is happening on the inside does not appear. Not because people are happy, but because real suffering has no place in those conversations. It never did. And you read that absence as confirmation of your hypothesis. If they are not struggling and you are, then you are the exception, the deviation, the one who cannot adapt to what everyone else has apparently mastered. But what you are not seeing is that each of those people is reading the same environment and reaching the same conclusion about themselves. Every person in that hallway, at that table, in that waiting room, is operating with the silent conviction that their particular weight is the only one that has not been declared, that the others somehow are genuinely fine. That is the mechanism, and it does not need any conscious agreement to function. It functions by inertia, by the absence of contrary evidence, by a cultural environment that has systematically removed the evidence that other people also collapse. The question this scenario raises is not a small one. If suffering is universal, if practically everyone carries something they cannot name in public, then why does the invisibility of suffering remain so stable? Who is benefiting from this silence? What exactly is being protected when pain is displaced into private space? And what does it cost, collectively, to operate in a regime where suffering can only exist where no one sees it? These questions have structural answers, not individual psychological ones, not character flaws, structural ones. That is what we are going to dissect. No specific thinker is needed to name what is happening here. The mechanism is too visible to require external authority, but it needs to be named with precision, because imprecision is exactly what keeps it operating. What is happening has a simple technical name: cultural suppression of suffering. It is not repression. Repression implies force, prohibition, explicit coercion. Suppression is different. Suppression happens when an environment systematically rewards one type of behavior and penalizes in a diffuse and silent way the opposite behavior. There is no law that says you cannot admit you are not doing well. There is no formal punishment for crying in front of colleagues. What there is something more effective than formal punishment: the withdrawal of recognition. Show your weight in an environment that is not prepared for it, and what happens is not explicit judgment. What happens is more subtle. The conversation changes subject. The group's rhythm accelerates. You are gently included back into the dynamic, but the exposure you made is not processed, not acknowledged. It generates no reciprocity. It simply disappears. Swallowed by the protocol the group knows how to follow, even without having agreed to follow it. That experience, repeated with sufficient frequency, produces a precise lesson, showing the weight is not worth the cost. Not because people are bad, but because the environment has no language for it, and without language there is no possible reception. There is only shared discomfort, which no one knows how to resolve, so everyone accelerates toward the exit. You learn this without anyone teaching you explicitly. The learning happens through accumulated experience, through attempts that did not land, through moments when you were slightly more honest than the protocol allowed, and the environment's response made clear that it had gone too far. And then you stop. Not consciously, you just stop. And you begin presenting the calibrated version, the version the environment is able to receive. And you do this so repeatedly that at some point the boundary between the calibrated version and what you actually feel begins to dissolve. Not because the pain disappeared, but because the practice of not expressing it became so automatic that the very perception of pain becomes less distinct. The suffering does not vanish. It goes on deepening into layers that are harder to access. That is the first mechanism, and it operates in everyone at the same time. Two people run into each other. They are work colleagues or long-time acquaintances or neighbors who cross paths regularly. There is a greeting. There is an exchange of routine questions. How are you doing? Fine. And you? Fine too. And both move on. Now imagine what was happening internally for each of those people at the exact moment of the encounter. Person A woke up at 3 a.m. with an objectless anxiety, lay staring at the ceiling for 40 minutes, and arrived at work with the silent conviction that something is wrong in a way they cannot articulate. Person B has spent 3 weeks carrying a decision they cannot make, and the indecision has settled in a place in the body that they cannot locate with precision. It is not pain. It is something more like a weight that will not lift. Neither of those realities appeared in the 10-second encounter, nor should they necessarily. There is nothing wrong with contexts that have purposes different from deep emotional confession. The problem is not that the greeting was superficial. The problem is that there is, for those two people, no other available context where what is happening internally could be said. Work does not have that space. Family has its own expectations. Friends are equally overloaded and equally silent. So what is happening internally for each of those people remains internal, without language, without a witness, without the minimal relief that comes from being recognized by another human being. And both move on, each with the impression that the other was doing fine. That is the central paradox. The silence regime sustains itself because every person who complies with it provides, for everyone around them, evidence that being fine is the normal state. No one is consciously lying. Everyone is simply following the protocol they learned. But the collective effect of that protocol is an illusion at scale, the illusion that suffering is the exception, when it is in reality the predominant condition, merely displaced to where it cannot be seen. There is a difference between suffering and being ashamed of suffering. Suffering is a condition. Being ashamed of suffering is a cultural product, and a far heavier one. When suffering cannot be expressed in public, it does not remain neutral. It undergoes a transformation. The original pain, which had a cause, a texture, an internal logic, begins to mix with the question of why it is still there, why it has not been resolved, why you are still carrying it while apparently everyone else has already moved on. And that is where pain stops being an experience and becomes an identity. It stops being something you are going through and begins to be interpreted as evidence of something you are. Weak, unable to adapt, insufficiently resilient for what life demands. That shift from experience to identity is where shame lives. And shame is exponentially heavier than the original pain, because pain has contours. Shame does not. Pain can be named and moved through. Shame, when it settles in as identity, becomes the environment where you live. It is no longer something that is happening to you. It is what you are. The silence regime did not create your pain, but it transformed your pain into shame. And that is damage of an entirely different magnitude. There is an implicit belief in the silence regime that is never said out loud, but that organizes everything. If you resolve your problems in private, they will be resolved. Suffering is a personal matter, so it must be handled personally, and when handled personally, it disappears. That belief is empirically false, and the mechanism by which it is false is precise. Suffering that finds no expression does not disappear. It finds form. Lateral, oblique forms frequently unrecognizable as suffering, disproportionate irritation at small things, the inability to be present in moments that should be simple, fatigue that does not respond to rest, the sensation of doing everything right and still feeling that something fundamental is wrong. These are not pathologies. They are suffering that found no direct outlet and found alternative routes. The body and mind do not discard what is not processed. They store it. And storage has a cost, one that is collected in forms we rarely connect to the original cause. When you are exhausted for no apparent reason, you rarely think, "This is the accumulation of years of suffering that was never named in public." You think, "I need more sleep. I need a vacation. I need to change jobs." And sometimes you do. But the structural problem remains, because the structural problem is not the amount of rest. It is the chronic absence of recognition of what was being carried. Privatized suffering does not vanish. It transforms. And the forms it takes are rarely recognized as suffering, so the cycle continues. There is a pact in operation in contemporary social life. No one sat down to sign it. No one voted. No one was consulted. But everyone is complying with it, with a consistency that would be admirable if it were not the cause of the problem we are describing. The pact is simple. Suffering is private. It may exist, but not in public. In public, the permitted register is equilibrium, or at the very least, a convincing performance of it. This pact is maintained by a mechanism of mutual reinforcement that requires no conscious coordination. You comply with the pact because everyone around you is complying. Everyone around you complies because you are complying. No one breaks from the protocol first, because going first carries an asymmetric risk. If you are the only one being honest in an environment that is not prepared for honesty, you do not produce openness. You produce discomfort, for yourself and for everyone around you. So no one goes first. Everyone waits for the signal that the environment is ready, and the environment will never give that signal, because the environment is composed of the very same people who are waiting for it. This is a Nash equilibrium applied to human suffering. Everyone would be better off if honesty were possible, but no one has a unilateral incentive to be honest first. The result is stable, and the cost of that stable equilibrium is paid silently by everyone who sustains it. You did not create this pact. You were born into an environment where it was already in force. You learned the rules without anyone needing to teach them to you explicitly. And now you comply with them with an efficiency you no longer even notice. There is an effect that the silence regime produces that is rarely named with precision: the erosion of the capacity to inhabit one's own experience. This requires careful explanation because it seems abstract but is very concrete. When you spend enough time translating your internal experience into the version appropriate for external consumption, something begins to happen in the space between the real experience and the presented version. That space keeps growing. Not all at once, gradually. Through the accumulation of small adjustments, each individually reasonable, which together produce a substantial distance between what is happening and what you are able to recognize about what is happening. Think of a person who learns over years that sadness is not welcome in the environment where they live, not because anyone said so explicitly, but because sadness, when it appeared, did not find an adequate response. The response was an attempt to resolve it quickly, or a change of subject, or a visible discomfort that made clear it was a burden for the person on the other side. The person learns. They stop naming the sadness, not to others, but to themselves, because naming it to oneself activates the impulse toward expression, and the impulse toward expression has been associated with cost. Over time, that person is no longer actively suppressing sadness. They are genuinely struggling to access it, not because the sadness disappeared, but because the access channels have been progressively deactivated through disuse. The capacity to recognize and inhabit one's own experience atrophies in the same way that any capacity atrophies when it is not exercised. The result is not equilibrium, it is gradual dissociation, a growing sensation of observing your life from a slightly external position, functioning, responding, showing up, but with a subtle distance between you and what is happening that is difficult to name and far more difficult to explain to another person. And here is the most perverse knot in the mechanism. The dissociation produced by the silence regime is frequently read as equilibrium. You stop feeling things with the same intensity. You become more efficient at managing emotions. You do not collapse. The environment reads this as maturity, as resilience, as evidence that you are doing well. But what happened was not maturity. It was adaptive anesthesia. And anesthesia, by definition, does not distinguish between what it is useful to block and what it is not. It blocks everything with the same efficiency. We have arrived at the central mechanism, the complete naming of what is happening. The silence regime we are describing is not the result of bad people or perverse intentions or a coordinated conspiracy. It is the product of a cultural structure that operates with its own logic, independent of the individual intentions of any person who comprises it. The structure works as follows. It rewards the performance of equilibrium because performed equilibrium is functionally more efficient for environments that need continuous production. A person who performs stability is more predictable, more reliable as a work partner, easier to coordinate, more pleasant to have around. Not because people are consciously instrumental with one another, but because the environments were structured around objectives that do not include the processing of human suffering. These environments are not hostile to emotion, they simply have no infrastructure for it. And what has no infrastructure becomes implicitly inappropriate. The penalization of authenticity is equally structural. It is not that someone punishes you for being honest. It is that honesty creates a type of demand for which the environment has no response, and the inability to respond adequately generates discomfort for everyone involved, and the discomfort generated is associated with its cause, which was your honesty. So honesty is avoided, not out of malice, out of collective incompetence for handling it, in an environment that never developed the tools for doing so. The result is a culture that is, in the aggregate, incapable of recognizing suffering as a shared condition. Not because suffering does not exist. It exists at massive scale, distributed across the entire population, but because suffering has been systematically removed from the space of shared visibility, displaced into the private, where it finds no language, no witness, no legitimacy. And suffering without legitimacy is not endured differently from suffering with legitimacy. It is only endured with more shame, more isolation, and more conviction that the problem is specifically, personally, yours. The inversion this diagnosis demands is precise. What you experienced as a personal failure of adaptation is, in large measure, the predictable response of a human being to a cultural structure that systematically removes the resources necessary for processing what all human beings inevitably go through. You are not struggling because you are weak. You are struggling, as practically everyone around you is, because the environment was never built to hold that, and it was built explicitly so that the fact that it was not built for that would never need to be said out loud. Now you see the code. The diagnosis is structural. That needs to be repeated with precision because the immediate tendency is to read what was said here as accusation or as absolution, and it is neither. Structural means independent of individual intentions. It means that genuinely good people in genuinely well-intentioned environments reproduce the mechanism with the same efficiency as any other environment. Because the mechanism does not depend on intention, it depends on structure, and the structure is there, operating, before any individual decision about how to behave within it. What this diagnosis reveals is not who is at fault. It reveals how the regime works that everyone is sustaining without having chosen to sustain it. And revealing how something works is not solving the problem. It is a prior and necessary condition for anything else that comes after. When a culture systematically suppresses the visibility of suffering, it does not eliminate suffering. This should be obvious, but it is not, because the suppression works well enough to create the illusion that suffering has been resolved when it has merely been displaced. But displacement is not resolution. It is a transfer of location with added cost. The added cost is shame, isolation, the gradual dissociation from one's own experience, the persistent belief that what you feel is a problem exclusively yours, in a world where practically everyone feels the same thing and has reached the same conclusion about themselves, and the collective cost, what this is doing to everyone, is not simply the sum of the individual costs. It is a qualitative loss of something that has no easy name, but that can be described approximately as follows: the capacity to exist in the presence of other human beings, with some degree of mutual recognition of the shared condition of being human. When no one admits they are not okay, suffering stops being a universal human experience and becomes an individual deviation. And that transition, from shared condition to personal failure, is where the regime most effectively destroys what should be possible between people. Reread what has been described here through a different lens. Every time someone answered fine when they were not fine, not because they wanted to lie, but because the environment had no space for any other answer, that person provided, without knowing it, the evidence another person used to conclude that their particular suffering was the exception. Every time an environment rewarded the performance of equilibrium, not consciously but through the incentive structure that organized it, that environment instructed all of its members about the cost of authenticity without ever needing to formulate that instruction explicitly. Every time someone displaced their suffering into private space, not out of weakness, but out of the accumulated learning that suffering in public generates discomfort for which no response is available, that person reproduced the regime that was weighing on them. There is no villain in this story. There is a system that sustains itself with an efficiency that required no intentional design. It emerged from the accumulation of individually reasonable responses to an environment that systematically made honesty more costly than performance. And what the system produced in the aggregate, over sufficient time, is a generation of people who are exhausted in a way they cannot name, isolated in a way they cannot demonstrate, and convinced that the problem is specifically theirs, while everyone around them shares exactly the same conviction about themselves. The landscape you read as evidence that the world was functioning, and you were not. That landscape was composed entirely of people reading the same landscape and reaching the same conclusion about themselves. Everyone read it wrong, because everyone read the same false data. each other's performed surface, and built upon it a hypothesis about their own inadequacy. That is the reach of the regime. It is not only that it silences individual suffering, it is that it uses each person's silence as an instrument of oppression against everyone else, without anyone needing to have done so intentionally, without anyone needing to be conscious of doing it. There is a question that the silence regime was structured, albeit not intentionally, to never allow to emerge out loud. The question is this: what would be possible if suffering could simply be said, not performed, not framed as a lesson already learned, not presented in the form of a story of overcoming, simply said as it is while it is happening, without the prior requirement that it have resolved itself in order to merit being expressed? What would change in the space between people if the shared condition of carrying something could be recognized as a shared condition instead of being managed as solitary shame? This is not a rhetorical question with an implicit answer. It is a genuinely open question, because the answer depends on something that does not yet exist as a widespread practice. And what does not yet exist as a practice cannot be described with precision from what currently exists. What can be said with precision is the negative. What the current regime produces is observable, measurable in the scale of the unrecognized suffering that circulates in every direction without finding ground to land on. What the alternative would produce, if the alternative could exist, and how it could exist, given that the regime sustains itself the way it does, cannot be answered by structural lucidity. Structural lucidity does not resolve. It illuminates the mechanism, and the illuminated mechanism is still there, operating, after the video ends. The question that remains is not what to do. The question that remains is, now that you see how the regime works, how does that change what you read when you look around? Will you still interpret the surface of equilibrium around you as evidence that suffering is the exception? Or will you begin to see suffering where it always was, everywhere, hidden inside every performance of stability you encounter? I will not offer a way out, because that is not what this channel does. Antidote philosophy does not resolve. It dissects. It names what was operating before it had a name, and the naming does not come with a manual. It comes with a visibility that, once acquired, cannot be switched off. You saw the code of the silence regime. You saw how it sustains itself. You saw what it produces. You saw that it is not your fault, but also not an accident of the system. It is the logic of the system functioning exactly as it was structured to function. And now the question is not what to do with that. The question is, can you keep reading the performed surface around you as reliable data about reality? Or has what was named here permanently changed how you interpret the silence you find everywhere? If this kind of analysis is what you are looking for, subscribing keeps this channel operating, and this channel will keep dissecting, one invisible mechanism at a time.